Okay, so the relativity of the reflected surfaces, one mirror relative to the other, and as reflecting the information existing between them, and of course we can see that the information existing between the mirrors is separate from the mirrors themselves, and in the strictest sense exists outside of the information that's found on the surface and through the recursion. Or we could say the information in the real object between the mirrors exists beyond as it is between the surfaces. But you see the relationship or the relativity or the entanglement that occurs when those two mirrors come into relativity. It causes a system where motion and turbulence emerges and therefore is able to be observed and measured. And I referred to this in I believe one of the first or second videos of this series, that if you have one mirror that's isolated, you only have a volume of information, a singular symmetry, reflected symmetry or image on the mirror. There cannot be no recursion. But whenever you bring another mirror into relativity to it, not only do you have another symmetry emerge on this mirror, but you also have two immediate and instantaneous recursive errors of time occur. So I'm showing the difference between an isolated system and entangled systems, entangled reflective surfaces. And if you have the recursion because you have the entanglement of two mirrors and you remove the relativity of mirrors, then all of the motion that you perceived when those mirrors were facing each other as reflecting an object, all of the motion and turbulence and potential changes and renormalizations and all of that you've seen recursively, first of all, it emerged because of the entanglement. If you take that entanglement away, then all of the turbulence, vibrations, and all of the membranes of recursion disappear. So in essence, we're showing that isolated system is minimally perceived as in motion. In a sense, because you don't have all of the recursive rows back behind it that moves relative to it, and all of that relative motion is what causes an intensified or a heightened perception of motion. But if you move that and just have a singular object, then you see that the ability to observe and measure extreme changes and shifts subsides, if not vanishes. So when you move one of the mirrors, when you have two mirrors relative to each other and you move one of them, you'll realize that with the slightest bit of motion, it increases and shakes all the recursive membranes existing on both sides of the equation of the string. We could refer to this as, you will see with the slightest bit of motion that all of the membranes of recursion right, left intensifies. Their vibrations, their motions, their movements, their expansions, contractions, all of these qualities exist within the recursive system and as indicative of recursive membranes moving relative to each other. So the faster the vibration or movement of the plane, the faster you shake one of the mirrors as entangled with another mirror, the more rapid and turbulent the recursive stages of reflection will move. So we can consider this range in turbulence, and this range is dictated by the amount of shaking, or the amount of motion, or the speed of the motion, of how fast or how hard you shake one of the mirrors. So we can consider this range in turbulence that exists in recursion as following suit or relative to what you do to that one mirror. So this range in turbulence or reflective recursive vibrations or motions, momentums that is implicated in the system of recursion on both sides, we can refer to this as a flow regime characterized by chaotic property changes. Can we not? So we can literally observe that the diffusion occurring represents the net movement of a recursive matrix, of the whole matrix. The net movement of that matrix, whenever one of the mirrors is moved when they're parallel, we can represent that as observing diffusion. So this diffusion occurring represents the net movement of the recursive matrix, And we refer to the recursive matrix as the region of low concentration. And this recursive matrix, this recursive fabric of space-time system, is moving relative to the movement of a higher region or concentration of information existing on the surface. And we consider this a higher region or concentration of information because it's closer to the real body of information, and it actually is a real image, and it actually does exist on a plane. All of the recursion is virtual. All of the recursion beyond this real surface, this real higher concentration of information, would represent the region of low concentration, and that represents the entropic, dynamic aspects of recursion. So we can state that both the surface information as well as the recursive information are both emergent due to the fact that the real objects are existing between the mirrors. In other words, the mirrors will not reflect the real object unless the real object is there. So again, we're showing that the real object, or this open part of the string, represents the necessary pre-existing quality of information that must be present in order for information to the mass holographic information to be observed and measured, whether on the surface or recursively. You have the two mirrors together, you remove the real object from between the mirrors, and all reflected recursive reasserted objects will vanish instantaneously. And that's the point. So if you place the particle information, we'll refer to the particle information as the quantum, the open part of the string, the real object. If you place the particle information back into the system after having removed it, then instantly the whole system, the whole holographic, reflective, recursive system, matrix, fabric of space-time will emerge again instantaneously. So this former to latter state of the experiment, real object relative to the plane surfaces between, beyond, outside, and real object not relative to the surfaces, this former to latter state of an experiment represents, in a sense, a Big Bang. And that represents something's coming from a former state of nothing. That is, if you look in the mirrors and there's no real object in between, then nothing is perceived, observed, or measured. But if you put the object in between and look at any of those mirrors, then of course you can begin to measure and observe and experiment with the holographic matrices that emerge. So in a sense, we can call this something from nothing. And I referred to this in the earlier video, that a person can look at two mirrors and the real object be hidden from view, and they not be able to see the real object, but they can look in the mirrors and identify the real object and understand what the quality and the nature, the symmetry of the real object is. They can use the holographic screens that are communicating, or that the information in the open part of the string is transmuted to these surfaces. They can see and understand the quality of that real object that they cannot see. Let me check my time here. So we can refer to the recursive mechanism and as occurring on both sides, left mirror, right mirror, as the concerted collective movement of groups or aggregates. And we refer to these groups of aggregates, or this collective motion of movement of the membranes moving relative to each other, relative to the movement of the surface volume of information, relative to that first image moving because you're moving the mirror plane that it exists on. As well, that the movement of the surface reflected volume of information is moving relative to the motion and direction of the real object placed between the mirrors, or the change in the distance between the real object and the mirrors, whether by moving the real objects toward or away from the mirror, or moving the mirrors themselves toward or away from each other, or toward or away from the real object. So here we can see that reflected information, and I refer to this as holographic information on screens, manifolds, surfaces, can be produced, and with all the nuances of change, motion, inertia, speed, vibration, expansion, contraction, all changes, and without any need for a prerequisite fluid, solid, or gas. So in essence, I'm saying we can remove our whole concepts of mass, or at least refine them, our concept of fluid, solid, gas. And if we're viewing a holographic system, we see we'd have to change the whole